I read The Masqueraders by Georgette. This was published in 1928. It is of its time, so there's some references in it that are a bit dodgy nowadays. But I will read it as written. I'm reading from a free downloaded copy because it isn't in copyright anymore. I thought it was all right to do that. And it's set in 1745 during the Jacobite uprising, when Bonnie Prince Charlie was trying to get the throne back for his father, who was in France. I love her characters, I love her plots, and it doesn't really matter if you don't know very much about the history. If you enjoy a rollicking romance, you'll enjoy this. Chapter 1, A Lady in Distress. It had begun to rain an hour ago, a fine driving mist, with the sky grey above. The gentleman riding beside the chaise surveyed the clouds placidly. "Faith, it's a wonderful climate," he remarked, of no one in particular. The grizzled serving man, who rode some paces to the rear, spurred up to him. "Best put up for the night, sir," he grunted. "There's an inn a mile or two on." The window of the chaise was let down with a clatter, and a lady looked out. "Child, you'll be wet," she said to her cavalier. "How far to Norman Cross?" The serving man rode up close to the chaise. "Another hour, ma'am. I'm saying we'd best put up for the night." "I'd as soon make Norman Cross," said the gentleman, "for all it's plaguily damp." "There's an inn close by, as I remember," the servant repeated, addressing himself to the lady. "En avanti, then, produce me the inn," the lady said. "Give you joy of your England, Peter, my little man." The gentleman laughed. "Oh, it's a comforting spot, Kate." The inn came soon into sight, a square white house, glimmering through the dusk. There were lights in the windows and a post-chaise drawn up in the court before it. The gentleman came lightly down from the saddle. He was of medium height and carried himself well. He had a neat leg encased in a fine riding boot, and a slender hand in an embroidered gauntlet. There was straightway a bustle at the inn. An ostler came running. Mine host appeared with a bow and a scrape, and a waiting man sped forth to assist in letting down the steps of the chaise. "2 bedchambers for myself and my sister," said the gentleman. "Dinner and a private room." Consternation was in the landlord's face. "Bedchambers, sir? Yes, on the instant. Polly, the 2 best bedchambers, and a fire's to be lit in them." A serving maid went scuttling off. "Sir, the private room." Mine host bowed and spread a pair of deprecating hands. "But this moment, sir, it was bespoken by a lady and a gentleman travelling north." He looked slyly and cast down his eyes. "But they stay only for dinner, sir, and if your honour and the lady would condescend to the coffee room, there's ne'er a soul likely to come tonight, and 'twill be private enough." There was a rustle of skirts. My lady came down from the chaise with a hand on her servant's shoulder. "The coffee room or any other, sir, I get out of this wet," she cried, and swept into the inn with her cavalier behind her. They found themselves straight in a comfortable large room. There was a table set and a wood fire burning in the hearth. A door led out into a passage at the back, where the stairs rose steeply, and another to one side, giving on to the tap room. A trim girl in a mob cap brought more candles and dropped a shy curtsy to the lady. "If you please, my lady, should I take your ladyship's cloak? Your ladyship's abigail?" "Alack, the creature's not with me," mourned Madam Kate. "Take the cloak up to my chamber, child, so." She put back the hood from her head and untied the strings round her throat. The cloak was given to the maid. Madam stood up in a taffety gown of blue spread over a wide hoop. She wore her fair ringlets en demi-toilette, free from powder, and with a blue ribbon threaded through, and a couple of curls allowed to fall onto her shoulder. The maid thought her a prodigiously lovely lady, and bobbed another curtsy before she went away with the cloak. My lady's brother gave his 3-cornered hat into his servant's keeping, and struggled out of his greatcoat. He was much of his sister's height, a little taller perhaps, and like enough to her in appearance. His hair was of a darker brown, confined demurely at the neck by a black ribbon, and his eyes showed more grey than blue in the candlelight. Young he seemed, for his cheek was innocent of all but the faintest down, but he had a square shoulder and a good chin, rounded and purposeful enough. The landlord, following him into the coffee-room, was profuse in apologies and obeisances, for he recognised a member of the quality. The lady wore a fine silk gown, and Mr. Marriott a modish coat of brown velvet with gold lacing, and a quantity of Mechlin lace at his throat and wrists. A pretty pair in all, with the easy ways of the quality and a humorous look about the eyes that made them much alike. The landlord began to talk of capons and his best burgundy, and was sent off to produce them. Miss Marriott sat down by the fire, and stretched one foot in its buckled shoe to the blaze. There was a red heel to her shoe, and marvellous embroidered clocks to his silken stockings. "So," said Miss Marriott, "how do you, my Peter?" "I don't melt in a shower of rain, I believe," Peter said, and sat down on the edge of the table, swinging one booted leg. "No faith, child, there's too much of you for that." The gentleman's rich chuckle sounded. "I'm sufficiently substantial, in truth," he remarked. He drew out his gold and enamelled snuff-box from one of his huge pockets, and took a pinch with an air, delicately shaking the ruffles of lace back from his wrists. A ruby ring glowed on one of his long fingers, while on the other hand he wore a big gold seal ring. A smile crept up to his eyes and lurked at the corners of his mouth. "I'd give something to know where the old gentleman is," he said. "Safe enough, I'll be bound," Madame answered, and laughed. "It's the devil himself, I believe, and will appear in London to snap his fingers under the noses of all King George's men." "Fie, Kate, my poor respected papa!" Mr. Marriott was not shocked. He fobbed his snuff-box and put it away. A faint crease showed between his brows. "For all he named London, egad, it's like his impudence. It's odds he's gone to France." "I don't permit myself to hope too much," said Miss Marriott, with a smile at once dreamy and impish. "He'll be there to lead us on another of his mad dances. If not, I've a mind to try our own fortunes." "In truth, I've a kindness for the old gentleman," said Mr. Marriott pensively. "His dances lead somewhere." "To lost causes." There was a hint of bitterness in the tone. Mr. Marriott looked up. "Ah, you've taken it to heart." "Not I." Kate jerked her shoulder as though to shake something off. "We went into it. Egad, why did we go into it?" "Ask the old gentleman," said Mr. Marriott, the slow smile creeping up again. "He had a loyal fervour, belike." Kate drew down the corners of her mouth. "It's a pleasing image. He meant it for a beau geste, I dare swear, and I suppose we went willy-nilly into the net. I don't regret it. The old gentleman meddled in sex's affairs, but we came out of that net. That was in the nature of adventuring. This—" Kate paused. "Bah, I hate lost causes. It was different." "For you?" Mr. Marriott lifted an eyebrow. "Did you want the prince, child?" "We fought for him while it lasted. He had the right, but now it's over, and the butchers made a shambles of the north, and there are those who've died on Tower Hill, while we try our fortunes, and the old gentleman weaves us a fresh net. I believe I'll turn respectable." "Alack, we were made for sobriety," said Mr. Marriott. Came the landlord and a serving maid with dinner. Covers were laid and a cork drawn. Miss Marriott and her brother sat down to fat capons and a generous pasty. They were left presently toying with sweetmeats and their wine. The maid bore off all that remained of the capons through the door that led into the passage. The door was left ajar, and allowed a glimpse of another door across the passageway. From behind it came the sound of a lady's voice raised in protest. "I won't, I tell you," it said. "I won't." There came the sound of a deeper voice, half coaxing, half bullying, and then the lady cried out again on a hysterical note of panic. "I won't go with you. You shan't elope with me against my will. Take me home. Oh, please, Mr. Markham, take me home." Miss Marriott looked at her brother. He got up and went unhurriedly to the door and stood listening. The man's voice was raised now in anger. "By God, Letty, you shan't fool me like that." Following on a crash from behind the door, as the fist banged on the table, came a choked, imploring murmur. No, barked the man's voice. If I have to gag you to Gretna, you'll go, Letty. Do you think I'm fool enough to let you slip through my fingers now? Mr. Marriott turned his head. My dear, I believe I don't like the noisy gentleman, he said calmly. Madam Kate listened to a cry of, My papa will come. I won't marry you. Oh, I won't. And a faint frown was between her eyes. There came the sound of a coarse laugh. Evidently the gentleman had been drinking. I think you will, he said significantly. Miss Marriott bit one fingernail. It seems we must intervene, Peter. Peter looked rueful and drew his sword a little way out of the scabbard. No, child, put up, said Madame, laughing. We know a trick worth two of that. We must have the fox out of his earth, though. Stay you there, said her brother, and went out into the courtyard and called to John, his servant. John came. Who's the owner of the post-chaise, John? Inquired Mr. Marriott. The answer was severe. It's a Mr. Markham, sir, running off to Gretna with the rich heiress, so they say, and the lady not out of her teens. There's wickedness. John's propriety is offended, murmured Miss Marriott. We will dispose, John, since God seems unwilling. I want a stir made. Best not meddle, said John phlegmatically. We've meddled enough. A cry of fire, mused Mr. Marriott. Fire or footpads? Where do I lie hid? Oh, you are with me already, admired Kate. Let me have a fire, John, or a parcel of daring footpads, and raise the ostlers. John fetched a sigh. We've played that trick once before. Will you never be still? Mr. Marriott laughed. It's a beauty in distress, John, and Kate must be up and doing. A grunt only was vouchsafed, and the glimmering of a grim smile. John went out. Arose presently in the courtyard a shout and a glow, and quickly uproar. Oh, I wonder how he made that fire, said Miss Marriott, amused. There's a shed and some straw, enough for John. Well, it's a fine stir. Mr. Marriott went to the window. Mine host leads the household out in force. The wood so damp 'twill be out in a moment. Do your part, sister. Mr. Marriott vanished into the deserted tap room. Miss Marriott added then to the stir by a scream, close followed by another, and a cry of Fire! Fire! Help! Oh, help! The door across the passage was burst open, and a dark gentleman strode out. What in hell's name? He began. His face was handsome in the swarthy style, but flushed now with wine. His eye lighted on Miss Marriott, and a smell of burning assailed his nostrils. What's the noise? Gad, is the place on fire? He came quickly into the coffee-room and received Miss Marriott in his unwilling arms. Miss Marriott neatly tripped up her chair, and with a moan of "Save me!" collapsed onto Mr. Markham's chest. He grasped the limp form perforce and found it a dead weight in his arm. His companion, a slim child of no more than 18, ran to the window. "Oh, it is only an old shed caught fire away to the right," she said. Mr. Markham strove to restore the fainting Miss Marriott. "Compose yourself, madam, for God's sake. No vapours. There's no danger. Damnation. Letty, pick that chair up." Miss Letty came away from the window towards Miss Marriott's fallen chair. Mr. Markham was tightly clasping that unconscious lady, wrath at his own helpless predicament adding to the already rich colour in his face. "The devil take the woman, she weighs a ton," swore Mr. Markham. "Pick the chair up, I say." Miss Letty bent to take hold of it. She heard a door open behind her, and turning, saw Mr. Marriott. Of a sudden, Miss Marriott came to life. In round-eyed astonishment, Miss Letty saw that lady no longer inanimate, but seemingly struggling to be free. Mr. Marriott was across the floor in a moment. "Unhand my sister, sir," he cried, in wonderful fury. Miss Marriott was thrust off. "God's life, 'twas herself," began Mr. Markham, but got no further. His chin came into sudden contact with Mr. Marriott's sword hilt, nicely delivered, and Mr. Markham fell heavily all among the table legs. "Oh, neatly done, i'faith," vowed Miss Marriott. "Now like an ox, as I live. Set the coach forward, Peter, and you, child, upstairs with you to my chamber." Miss Letty's hand was caught in a firm clasp. Quite bewildered, she was swirled away by the competent Miss Marriott. Miss Marriott's brother put up his sword and went out to the court. John seemed to rise up out of the gloom to meet him. "All well, sir." Mr. Marriott nodded. "Where's the dear gentleman's chaise, John?" John jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Horses put to?" inquired Mr. Marriott. "Aye, they're ready to be off. The men are in the tap room. It's dry they are after the great fire. There's an ostler to the horses' heads, though." "I don't want that ostler there," said Mr. Marriott. "Drive the chaise past Stilton, John, and hide it somewhere where the gentleman won't find it too soon." "Hide a chaise and horses, is it?" John growled. "It is, John," said Mr. Marriott serenely. "Tell that ostler that I want a horse saddled on the instant. One of our own, if need be. I shall set the dear gentleman after you, John. God speed you." "Ah, it's a mad couple you are," said John. But he moved away to where the lights of the chaise shone. Mr. Marriott heard him give the order to the ostler and offered to hold the horses' heads. He heard the ostler run off towards the stables, and himself turned back to the coffee room, smiling placidly. Miss Marriott had come downstairs again and was standing by the fallen Mr. Markham, calmly surveying him. "Well, child, is it done?" she asked. The clatter of horses and the rumble of wheels on the cobbles answered her. John was off. They heard the chaise roll away down the road to London. Miss Marriott laughed and dropped her brother a mock curtsy. "My compliments, child. It's you have the head, indeed. Now, what to do for the poor gentleman? Water, my Peter, and a napkin. Observe me all solicitude." She sank down onto the floor and lifted Mr. Markham's head into her lap. Mr. Marriott was chuckling again as he handed her the water and a napkin. The landlord came hurrying in and stared in horror at what he saw. "Sir, madam, the gentleman's coach is off." "Oh, Lord, madam, the gentleman!" "Off, is it?" Mr. Marriott was interested. "Tut, tut, and the lady in it, belike." The landlord's jaw dropped. "Aye, that would be it. But what's come to the gentleman, sir?" "Good Lord, sir, never say." "The poor gentleman," said Miss Marriott, holding a wet napkin to Mr. Markham's brow. "'Twas the drink turned the head on his shoulders, I dare swear. An accident, host. I believe he won't die of it." "A warning to all abductors," said Mr. Marriott piously. A gleam of understanding shot into the landlord's eyes. "Sir, he'll be raving mad when he comes to." "A warning to you, good fellow, not to be by," said Mr. Marriott. There was a significance in Mr. Marriott's voice. It occurred to mine host that the less he knew of the matter, the better it might be for himself on all sides. He went out discreetly, what time Mr. Markham gave vent to a faint groan. Mr. Markham came slowly back to consciousness and opened heavy eyes. He did not once remember much, but he was aware of a swollen jaw which hurt him. A cool hand was placed on his brow, and something wet was laid on his sore chin. He rolled his eyes upwards, groaning, and saw a face, a fair face bent over him, framed in golden ringlets. He stared up at it, trying to collect his bemused wits, and vaguely it seemed to him that he had seen that face before, with its fine, rather ironical blue eyes, and its curiously square chin. He blinked and frowned in the effort to pull himself together, and saw the delicate mouth smile. "Thank God you are better," came a cooing voice. "I've been in an agony, dear sir. Pray lie still. 'Twas a cruel blow, and oh, the misunderstanding. Peter, a glass of wine for the gentleman. There, sir, let me but raise your head." Mr. Markham allowed it, perforce, and sipped at the wine held to his lips. Some of the mists were clearing from his brain. He raised himself on an elbow and looked around. "Oh, you are much better," cooed the voice. "But gently, sir. Don't, I implore you, overtax your strength." Mr. Markham's gaze came to rest on a flowered waistcoat. He put a hand to his head, and his eyes travelled slowly up the waistcoat to Mr. Marriott's grave face. Mr. Marriott was on one knee, glass of wine in hand. Mr. Marriott looked all concern. Recollection came. "Bernard, you're the fellow." Mr. Markham's hand went to his jaw. He glared at Peter Marriott. Did you? By God, sir, did you?" "Let me help you to a chair, sir," said Mr. Marriott gently. "In truth, you are shaken, and I cannot wonder at it. Sir, I cannot sufficiently beg your pardon." Mr. Markham was on his feet now, dizzy and bewildered. "Was it you knocked me down, sir? Answer me that," he panted. Alas, sir, I did, said Mr. Marriott. I came in to find my sister struggling, as I thought, in your arms. Can you blame me, sir? My action was the impulse of a moment. Mr. Markham was put into a chair. He fought for words, a hand still held to his jaw. Struggling? She flung herself at me in a swoon, he burst out. Miss Marriott was kneeling at his feet, napkin in hand. Mr. Markham thrust it aside with an impotent snarl. You have the right to be angry, sir, sighed Miss Marriott. 'Twas all my folly, but, oh, sir, when the bustle started and they were crying fire without, I scarce knew what I did. Her fair head was bent in modest confusion. Mr. Markham did not heed her. Blame you? Yes, sir, I can, he said wrathfully. A damnable little puppy to... Words failed him, and he sat nursing his jaw and fuming. Mr. Marriott said haughtily, You're heated, sir, and I believe excusably. I don't heed what you say, therefore. I've asked your pardon for a mistake, understandable, I contend, that I made. Puppy, snapped Mr. Markham, and drank off the rest of the wine in the glass. It seemed to restore him. He got up unsteadily, and his hot gaze swept round again. Letty, he shot out, where is the girl? Dear sir, indeed you are not yourself yet. Miss Marriott laid a soothing hand on his arm. There's no girl here save myself. She was shaken off. No girl, you say? Roared Mr. Markham, and went blundering towards the room across the passage. Letty, he shouted. Letty, I say. Hell and damnation, her cloak's gone. He came back, his face dark with rage and suspicion, and caught at Mr. Marriott's straight shoulder. Out with it. Where is she? Where have you hidden her? You don't trick me, my fine sir. Miss Marriott, hovering watchfully, cast herself between them and clung to her brother. No, no, she cried. No swords, I do beseech you, sir. You are raving. There's no girl here that I have seen. Mr. Marriott put his sister aside. But wait, he said slowly. As I remember, there was a lady in the room as I came in. A child with black hair. My sister was overwrought, sir, and maybe forgets. Yes, there was a lady. He looked around as though he expected to see her lurking in some corner. Dummy, it won't serve, cried out the infuriated Mr. Markham, and went striding off the door that led into the tap room, calling loudly for the landlord. Mine host came quickly, with an uneasy look in his face. In answer to Mr. Markham's furious query, he said nervously that during the scare of the fire, someone had driven off with his worship's chaise, and he doubted but that the lady was in it. Mr. Markham swung around to face Peter Marriott again, and there came a red light into his eyes, while his hand fumbled at his sword. Ah, you're in this, he snarled. Mr. Marriott paused in the act of taking snuff. Your pardon, sir, he asked in some surprise. A lady? Gone off in your post-chaise? Myself in it? I don't understand, sir. Who is the lady, and why should she go off so? Why, it's churlish of her, I protest. Mr. Markham seemed undecided. It's no business of yours, he said savagely, but if I did find it was you who did it, which way did the chaise go? Towards London, sir, nervously answered mine host. But 'tis only what Tom says. I didn't see it myself, and indeed, sir, Mr. Markham said something between his teeth, at which mine host cast a horrified glance at Miss Marriott. The lady appeared to be unmoved. Saddle me a horse at once. Where's my hat? Light dawned on Mr. Marriott. Egad, it's a runaway, Kate. Faith, sir, it seems my impetuosity was indeed ill-timed. A horse, of course. You should be up soon enough with the chaise. A horse for the gentleman. Mr. Marriott swept out into the court, bearing mine host before him. It's ready saddled, sir, but Tom says the gentleman ordered it half an hour since, said the puzzled landlord. Saddled and ready, eh? Then see it brought round to the door, for the gentleman is in a hurry. Yes, sir, but how came it that the horse was bespoke when the gentleman was laying like one dead? Bespoke? A ruse, man, a ruse, and your man in madam's pay, very like. Best keep your mouth shut. Ah, behold the bereft gentleman. Mr. Markham came stamping out with his hat rammed over his nose, and managed to hoist himself into the saddle with the assistance glared down upon Mr. Marriott. "I'll settle with you later," he promised ferociously, and setting spurs to his horse, dashed off into the darkness. Miss Marriott came out to lay a hand on her brother's shoulder. "The dear gentleman," she remarked. "Very well, child, but what next?" Chapter 2. Arrival of a large gentleman. Brother and sister went back into the coffee room. As they entered by one door, a little figure tiptoed in at the other, and stood poised on one toe as if for flight. "Has he gone?" breathed Miss Letitia. It was Peter Marriott who went forward and took the lady's hand. "Why, yes, child, gone for the moment," he said, and led her to the fire. She raised a pair of big pansy brown eyes. "Oh, thank you, sir," she said, "and thank you too, dear madam." Miss Marriott flushed slightly, whereat the humorous look came into Peter's eye again. He looked down at Miss Letty gravely enough and pulled a chair forward. "Sit down, madam, and let us have the story, if you please. I should desire to know how we may serve you." "You have served me," vowed the lady, clasping her hands in her lap. "My story is all folly, sir, wicked folly rising out of the most dreadful persecution." "You shock me, madam." Miss Marriott came to the fire and sat down beside the little lady, who promptly caught her hand and kissed it. "I don't know what I should have done without you," she said fervently, "for I had quite made up my mind I didn't want to go to Gretna Green at all. You see, I'd never seen him in his cups before. It was a terrible awakening. He became altered altogether once we were out of London, and I was afraid a little." She looked up blushing. "At home, when I saw him, he was so different, you see." "Do I understand, my dear, that you consented to elope with the gentleman?" inquired Miss Marriott. The black curls were nodded vigorously. "I thought it would be so romantic," sighed Letty. She brightened. "And so it was when you hit him," she added, turning to Peter. "It was positively marvellous." "Did you elope with him for the romance of it?" asked Mr. Marriott, amused. "Well, that, and because of my papa," said Letty, "and because of being bored. Oh, have you ever known, ma'am, what it is to be cooped up and kept so close that you are ready to die of boredom?" "In truth, I've led something of a rover's life," said Miss Marriott. "But continue, child." "I am an heiress," announced Letty in tones of the most lugubrious. "My felicitations, ma'am," bowed Mr. Marriott. "Felicitations? I wish I were a pauper, sir. If a man comes to the house, my papa must needs imagine he is after my money. He said that of Gregory Markham, and indeed I think he was right," she said reflectively. "Ma'am, I think fathers are the veriest plague." "We have suffered, child," said Miss Marriott. "Then, ma'am, you will feel for me. My papa puts a hateful, disagreeable woman to be my duenna, and I'm so guarded and sheltered that there's never anything amusing happens to me, ever, in spite of having been brought to town. Add to all that, ma'am, Sir Anthony Fanshawe, and you'll see why I had to come to the pitch of doing anything only to get away." "I feel we are to deplore Sir Anthony, Kate," said Mr. Marriott. "It's not that I'm not fond of him," Letty explained. "I've always been fond of him. But conceive, ma'am, being required to marry a man whom you've known all your life, a man, too, of his years and disposition." "I perceive in you a victim of parental tyranny, child," said Miss Marriott. "We consign Sir Anthony to perdition." Letty giggled at that. "Oh, never, ma'am. 'Tis a model of prudence and the virtues, and 35 years old at the very least." Mr. Marriott flicked a speck of snuff from his sleeve. "And to escape this greybeard, hence the young Adonis yonder, I suppose." Miss Letty hung her head. He was not very young either, I suppose," she confessed, "and I have been very silly and wicked, I know, but indeed I thought him vastly more entertaining than Tony. You could not for your life imagine Tony excited, or in a scrape, or even hurried. And Gregory said such pretty things, and it was also romantic. I was misled." "The matter's plain to the meanest intelligence, madam," Mr. Marriott assured her. "I discover in myself a growing desire to meet the phlegmatic Sir Anthony." His sister laughed. "Aye, that's to your taste. But what's the next step?" "Oh, she goes with us along to London. Pray, ma'am, may we know your name? 'Tis Letitia Grayson, sir. My papa is Sir Humphrey Grayson of Grayson Court in Gloucestershire. He's afflicted with the gout. I expect you may see him by and by, for I left a note for him, and he would be bound to find it. We await his coming, then, said Miss Marriott. It solves the matter. My Peter, bespeak a bedchamber for Miss Grayson. A confiding hand was slipped into Kate's as Mr. Marriott strolled away to the door. Please, will you call me Letty? Said Miss Grayson shyly. Mr. Marriott made an odd grimace at the panel of the door and went through into the tap-room. Mine host had barely recovered from his very natural bewilderment at finding that the supposed fugitive was still in his house, when there came the sound of a chaise bowling at a rare speed along the road. It drew up at the inn, and in the light of the lamps Mr. Marriott saw a servant jump down. He pursed his lips in a soundless whistle. "Ooh, this should be Papa," he said pensively. "Your fourth room will be wanted, host." He went back into the coffee-room to find that Miss Letty was at the window peering out already. "Your papa's, I believe," announced Mr. Marriott. "I'm afraid it is," agreed Miss Letty, "and yet with the gout plaguing him so much. Oh, lud, as I live, 'tis Anthony." Miss Marriott threw her brother a comical look. "And so your desires are fulfilled, child. We are all impatience, Letty." Mr. Marriott stood by her chair and took snuff. The door opened to admit a large gentleman who came in very leisurely. "Lud, it's a mammoth," said Miss Marriott for her brother's private ear. "Oh, are you jealous?" he retorted. The large gentleman paused on the threshold and put up his quizzing glass, through which he blandly surveyed the room. He was a very large gentleman indeed, with magnificent shoulders and a fine leg. He seemed to rather fill the room. He had certainly a presence and a personality. He wore a tie wig of plain brown and carried his hat under his arm. The hilt of his sword peeped out from between the folds of his greatcoat, but in his hand he held a cane. "The gentleman would appear to be annoyed," murmured Mr. Marriott, looking at the lines about the newcomer's mouth and square jaw. "La, my dear, how can you say so?" marvelled Miss Marriott, seeing the large gentleman's grey eyes calm and bored. She rose with an air and swept a curtsy. The gentleman must not be allowed to dominate the rooms thus. It seemed he had the way of it. "Make your leg, child," she threw over her shoulder at Peter. "We are under observation." The sternness about Sir Anthony's mouth had vanished. He smiled and showed a row of very even white teeth. He bowed with easy grace. "Madam, your most obedient. Sir, yours." Mr. Marriott took Miss Letty to receive Miss Grayson, who looked him defiantly between the eyes. He smiled still, but he did not offer to take her hand. "You should be whipped, Letty," he said pleasantly. Miss Grayson flushed. "Deed, sir, and did you bring your cane for that purpose?" she demanded. "No, my dear, but I should be happy to benefit you that far." Peter Marriott was amused and permitted his chuckle to be heard. "Faith, it's a stern suitor." "You are very rude and hateful," declared Miss Grayson, outraged. Sir Anthony laid down his cane and his hat and began to take off his greatcoat. As one who had no further interest in Miss Grayson, he took out his snuff-box, unfobbed it, and held it out to Mr. Marriott. His hand was very white and finely shaped, but it looked to have some strength. "Sir," said he, smiling sleepily, for all his grey eyes were alert beneath their rather heavy lids, "you will permit me to thank you on behalf of my friend Sir Humphrey Grayson for your services to his daughter." Mr. Marriott helped himself to a pinch of snuff. Grey eyes met grey. The humorous look played around Mr. Marriott's mouth. "Lud, here's a solemnity," he said. "I am Miss Grayson's servant to command." Miss Grayson forgot her dignity. "Tony, 'twas wonderful. His sword was out in a trice, and I thought he was about to run that odious Markham right through the body, but just as it was too monstrously exciting for words, the point seemed to flash upwards, and the hilt caught Markham on the chin." She demonstrated with a small fist to her own pretty chin. "He went down like a stone," she ended dramatically. Her glance fell on Miss Marriott by the fire. And Miss Marriott, too, was splendid, Tony, for she pretended to swoon in Markham's arms. Mr. Marriott looked down at his sister, something quizzically. "My dear, I eclipse you," he murmured. He turned again to Sir Anthony. "Thus we mourn our departed suitor. Now, where did you find my man John?" He began to pour wine, and handed one glass to the large gentleman. "At Stilton," Sir Anthony replied, "just before I saw my friend, Mr. Markham. He was endeavouring to hide a chaise and horses, which aroused my suspicions. He was induced to confide in me." Mr. Marriott looked meditatively at that square, handsome face. "I wonder why," he said, for he knew his John. A singularly attractive smile crossed Sir Anthony's face. "My charm of manner, sir, I believe," he said. There came a laugh from Miss Marriott. "I begin to have a kindness for the large gentleman," she remarked to the room at large. "And you met the so dear Mr. Markham, sir?" "Hardly, madam. I had rather say I saw the so dear Mr. Markham pass me in a cloud of mud, I believe." "I wonder, did he see you?" Miss Marriott's eyes were bright with laughter. "I'm almost persuaded that he did," said Sir Anthony. "Then I take it we are not to expect his return." Miss Marriott cocked a knowing eyebrow. "I hardly think so, madam," said Sir Anthony placidly. Miss Marriott looked at Miss Grayson. "Why, child, I like the large gentleman, I protest," she said. "Pray, sir, have you dined?" "So far I have not had the time, madam, but I have reason to hope the landlord is preparing dinner for me at this moment." Mine host himself came in most opportunely then, with the serving maid behind him, carrying a loaded tray. A fresh cover was laid, a roasted chicken placed before Sir Anthony, and a fresh bottle uncorked. "You permit, madam?" Sir Anthony bowed towards Miss Marriott. "Pray, sir, be seated. You must be ravenous." "I confess I hate to miss my dinner," said Sir Anthony, and began to carve the chicken. "There is something of me to maintain, you see," he added, with a twinkle and a glance cast down at his noble bulk. Miss Grayson cut in on Miss Marriott's laugh. "Food!" she ejaculated scornfully, and tapped an impatient foot. Sir Anthony paid no heed. "Well, Tony, you will come nigh on 100 miles to rescue me, as I suppose, and now have you nothing at all to say but that you have missed your dinner?" "That thought has been absorbing me for the past 20 miles, said Sir Anthony imperturbably. "And me in peril!" cried the affronted Miss Grayson. Sir Anthony raised his eyes from the chicken and looked coolly across at her. "Oh, were you in peril?" he inquired. "I came merely to put an end to an indiscretion, as I thought." "Peril? At the hands of such a monster?" Miss Grayson was indignant. "I wonder, sir, that you need ask." Sir Anthony poured wine for himself and Mr. Marriott. "My dear Letty," said he, "you've so frequently assured us that Mr. Markham is a model of all the virtues that I did you the honour to respect your judgment." Miss Grayson turned scarlet and looked as though she were about to cry. "You didn't, Tony. You're just being disagreeable, and he's not a model of virtue. He's an odious brute, and so are you." "Tut, child, the gentleman's hungry and will be better for his chicken," said Mr. Marriott. "I am not a child," flashed Miss Grayson, and was off in a swirl of skirts to Miss Marriott's side. From the shelter of Miss Marriott's arm she hurled a tearful defiance. "And I would sooner go to Gretna with that monster than marry you, Sir Tony." Sir Anthony remained unmoved. "My dear Letty, if this piece of absurdity was to escape my attentions, believe me, it was not in the least necessary. So far as I'm aware, I've never asked you to marry me, nor have I the smallest intention of so doing." This pronouncement brought Miss Grayson's head up from Kate's shoulder. In round-eyed astonishment she gazed at Sir Anthony, busily engaged with the wing of a chicken. "I have to suppose," said Miss Marriott sharply, "that the gentleman is an original." Mr. Marriott turned away to hide a laughing face. "These family arrangements," he said. But Papa says," began Miss Grayson. "Why, Tony, don't you want to marry me?" "I do not," said Sir Anthony. Miss Grayson blinked, but she did not seem to be offended. "Why don't you?" she asked with naive curiosity. At that Sir Anthony looked up, and there was a twinkle in his eyes. "I suppose, Letty, because my taste is at fault." "Well," Miss Grayson digested this in silence. She disengaged herself from Kate's arm and went slowly to the table. Sir Anthony rose at her approach and received one little hand in his large one. "Tony, will you tell Papa?" she asked. "I have told him, my dear." "How did he take it?" asked Miss Grayson anxiously. "Philosophically, child." "I'm so glad," said Miss Grayson with a relieved sigh. "If you don't want to marry me, Tony, I can go home with a quiet mind, and I can even forgive you for being so disagreeable." "And I," said Sir Anthony, "can finish my dinner."